All right, you are all set.
Got it. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where and when you're joining us. Welcome to the March 2025 edition of the Quattrone Center Conviction, Integrity, and Wrongful Convictions monthly meeting series. As always, this is presented as part of our training and technical assistance provision through a cooperative agreement with the Bureau of Justice Assistance under the Upholding Rule of Law and Preventing Wrongful Convictions grant programs. We come to you each month and continue to offer these services through those two programs. Today, I am delighted to introduce our speaker from the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission, folks that we have had the pleasure of hearing from in previous months. This month, we welcome Emma Paul, Victim Services Program Manager. Taylor, would you advance the slide, please? Emma provides direct support and advocacy to victims of crime. She develops and implements trauma-informed policies and practices, and she consults with investigators on best approaches to engaging with victims. And she also does presentations like this, and I'm going to cede the floor and give her the time. So, Emma, if you go ahead and share your slides, I will cede the floor to you, and
Absolutely.
please talk to us.
Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. So I won't be able to see the screen and chat while I'm in presentation mode. So I ask you, if you have any questions, please just come off mute and let me know. And I'll stop a couple times during the presentation to see if there are any questions in the chat. So to start, like Adina said, my name is Emma. I'm the Victim Services Program Manager for a state agency called the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission. I've been with the commission for a little bit more than 5 years. I was hired under the Commission's first ever Victims of Crime Act grant, or VOCA grant, and started our in-house victim services program. It wasn't something that we had done prior to my joining the Commission. So I really had the immense responsibility and joy of crafting this program and being really thoughtful about how do we create an approach to crime victims and witnesses and to our claimants, the people claiming innocence, that honors their humanity and gives them a little bit of choice and power in the process of an innocence investigation. So a few things I aim to talk about today. I'm sure we have all heard the term trauma-informed. It's become very popular in the services professions and in criminal justice. But I want to be specific about what it means for us, for those of us conducting post-conviction innocence investigations. What does it look like in practice? What can we do to adopt a trauma-informed approach when we don't have many resources? And I want to leave you with a couple practical ideas you can consider implementing. I think you'll probably notice as well that a trauma-informed approach really does overlap with a lot of evidence-based approaches you're probably already familiar with. So I hope that this dovetails nicely with some of the work you're already doing. I'm going to discuss the development of our victim services program over the last 5 years. The goal of the original grant was to promote meaningful victim participation. So I'll talk about how we figured out how to define that goal and how to measure it. I'll talk about how I collaborate with our investigators and what relationship building looks like between my role and the investigators on staff. And then I'll discuss the trauma concepts that underpin some of our practices and policies so you can apply the science to your own work. And to begin, this is something we all know. This is the water that we're all swimming in. But I want to start the presentation with a recognition of the immense injustices that our agencies are taking on. Even without the complication of a wrongful conviction, the vast majority of people involved in the criminal justice system who have been arrested, jailed, or imprisoned have experienced trauma. Crime victims and families and communities have to deal with the aftermath of violent crime and figure out what recovery looks like for them. In wrongful conviction cases, someone has been kidnapped from their life, They've lost their freedom, they've lost access to their relationships and their life experiences. And then we're all implicated when that wrongful conviction is uncovered. As a whole, we have to grapple with how did we get it so wrong? How have we caused so much harm? So we know that we're really close to immense harm and suffering when we do this work. And that has an impact on how our work lands with us. And then in turn, how we can show up when we're engaging with witnesses, victims, and defendants in our work. I want to highlight direct quotes from crime victims and from exonerees, so we can hear directly from them what it is like to go through this process. So I'll pause for a second for people to read this slide.
Would you read them aloud for us as well, please?
Oh, yeah. Okay, the first quote is, "It was harder going through the re-victimization than it was through the rape. Now you have the same feelings of that pain. You have the same scariness. You have the same fear. You have the same panic. But now you have this flood of guilt." And then the second quote is, "I was scared to look out the door. I was scared for someone to come to the door. Because now who I thought was the bad guy, it wasn't him. My bad guy didn't have a face, so I didn't know who it could be." And I'm always really struck by that line, "my bad guy didn't have a face," because I think it really demonstrates the way threat can expand when you add uncertainty. And dealing with that uncertainty is something we should consider in our roles. And then from exonerees, the first quote, "I was one of those individuals, but I thought I was maintaining my sanity. I discovered and realized that you could lose your marbles about something that happened 2 hours ago. You might think I thought I was crazy. But that didn't make sense. It didn't add up. It might not be about a situation that happened 10, 15 minutes ago. It might be about a situation that happened 10 or 20 years ago, and it just came back to me." And then the second quote, "On the surface, everything was fine. I was working, taking care of my kids, and figuring it out. But on the inside, there was a restlessness that started to build. And that's the piece of it. You think you're doing okay, and then all of a sudden, something happens, and you realize you're really not. And I kept telling myself I was okay. How could I not be now that I was out? It continued to get worse and worse, and I kept trying to extinguish it by drinking, having fun, and staying busy, but I didn't give myself time. I was exhausted." I want to again note that restlessness, because we'll see it really intersects with what we know about how trauma impacts our brain and our systems, that restlessness, that anxiety and energy. So our natural next question is, what do we do about this? We're all drawn to this work because we care about righting injustice. That's how you end up trying to deal with wrongful convictions and make sure that the right perpetrator is held responsible for crime. So we're all moved to be a part of the solution, and I would say most of us have an altruistic drive. And so we can recognize the depth of the harm, and now what do we do next? How do we limit that harm? We know it's bad, now what? I want to start with this general definition of trauma-informed care. This is created by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So they define trauma-informed care as, first, realizing the widespread impact of trauma. Second, recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. Responding by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And then finally, resisting re-traumatization. This is really broad, and I want to focus on these two center steps, recognizing the signs and symptoms and responding with policies, procedures, and practices, because this is where we can take action and do practical things. I thought a little bit about how do we make this applicable to innocence investigations and post-conviction work, and applied those basic principles into our work. First, the same, recognize how trauma impacts defendants, witnesses, victims, and staff. I underlined staff because I think we often fall off that list. and think about trauma as something that happens externally to our organizations and not internally and not to the individual investigators. Develop policies and procedures that mandate a compassionate approach to defendants, witnesses, and victims. Bias is totally natural. We often will, because we're investigating old cases, will be interacting with and interviewing people who might have been victimized or harmed by the crime we're investigating, but have since gone on to perpetrate harm themselves. But we need to stay consistent about the support we offer people, because we are at the same time asking them to revisit difficult memories. And that's where the policies and procedures come in to give us that grounding and that foundation that we're going to approach everyone when we're asking difficult things of them with the same compassionate way. Prepare staff for the emotional and mental challenges of reviewing cases and claims. It's important that we're totally transparent about the challenges of this job and that we can openly discuss the way that it can hit you and stick with you. And then finally, arm staff with tools that build competency around handling difficult and sensitive interactions. We probably have all had an experience where we went to do an interview or speak with someone involved with a case and it went really wrong. And that person got very upset or agitated, seemed really disrupted. And it feels awful to walk away from that situation and to think, I don't know how I could have handled that differently. So I think it's important we all have simple protocols where if things get heightened, if the temperature is rising in an interaction, we know how to engage. And even if that doesn't completely fix the scenario, because it's unlikely it would, we can walk away saying, I did my best there, I used the tools I had, and hopefully I've connected them with some resources. Feeling helpless vastly increases your exposure or your response to trauma exposure. It really heightens the impact that trauma exposure has on you. So we need to have tools to make sure we circumvent that, where that helpless feeling might come in. So briefly, the science from not a neuroscience, but I'll do my best. I want to think about how threat and trauma is analyzed in the brain and what the brain does in response to that. So there are a couple areas of the brain we'll talk about. First, the brain stem, which essentially is responsible for everything we can do as infants. So it controls eating, sleeping, breathing, blinking, waking, feeling temperature, hunger, wetness, and pain. Very instinctual, very basic. Above that, we have the limbic system, which develops over the first 6 years of our life, which means that it's very much influenced by our early experiences. If you have strong relationships with caregivers, if you have a stable home life, positive experiences in your early childhood, your limbic system will develop differently than if your home life and early childhood are marked by uncertainty or neglect or abuse. The limbic system is responsible for emotions and detecting danger. And I want to note, detecting danger is totally subjective. This limbic system is shaped by our life experiences, so what we deem to be dangerous is going to be different between individuals. And then finally, we have the prefrontal cortex, or our conscious, rational brain. This develops into our mid-20s, as anyone who's ever spoken to a teenager would fairly observe. So this part of the brain helps us plan our day, sequence our actions, develop and accomplish our goals, manage our time. This is where we can empathetically understand others and essentially figure out how people work and how things around us work. And it's sophisticated, and in its sophistication, it's pretty slow moving. So when our brain detects threat, it doesn't want us to be in this rational, conscious part of our mind where we're thinking through our options and making plans relatively slowly. When the alarm system sounds, we're essentially shutting down that prefrontal cortex, going back to the more instinctual basic parts of the brain so we can respond really quickly. So for instance, you're walking down the street and a car starts careening towards you. You don't want to stop and think, okay, what are my options? Should I back up? Can I jump over this fence? Your body's going to respond, perhaps before you're even conscious of what's happening. And so, ideally, you've escaped the threat and you can regain your senses, return to equilibrium, calm your system, and that conscious brain can come back online. There's also a full physical reaction when the alarm is being sounded. It's not just something your brain is doing. You're releasing all of these hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Your heart starts pumping, your vision narrows, your digestion is slowed. Again, it's about rerouting resources from the things that aren't totally necessary to survive the traumatic event to those that can help you survive and cope with what's happening. So being able to protect, move, get out of the event changes how that alarm system works in the future. If you're regularly exposed to threat, your alarm system is going to be primed to misfire. If you can't escape the threat, again, your alarm system is going to continue to misfire. But the vast majority of people recover from a traumatic experience. So this figure on the right shows disruption in normal functioning on the vertical axis and time from the traumatic event on the horizontal axis. So you can see if you have a seriously traumatic event at the top, you might deal with chronic disruptions due to traumatic symptoms over time. But even if you have a moderate experience, you are absolutely able to recover. And then there are a minority of people who end up having a delayed onset of trauma symptoms. But the vast majority end up in the recovery and resilience pathways here. That's probably about 90% of people either end up in recovery or resilience. So while it's important that
I think we're missing the image that goes with what you're saying. We're still looking at the brain image.
how about now?
Symptoms of trauma. There it is. Perfect. From traumatic
Okay.
event to traumatized.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Well, now you can see what I was talking about. So we have different pathways of recovery or different pathways of how we develop over time, how much trauma symptoms are disrupting our normal functioning. And when I say normal functioning, I mean things like, can you hold a job? Can you maintain relationships with a partner, with family, and with friends? Can you maintain your household? Or is your experience of the trauma so haunting to you that you can't go about those day-to-day activities? And so, as I was saying, most people end up in recovery and resilience. That's about 85% of people who've had a traumatic experience are able to ultimately overcome and calm those symptoms. So while it's important we take trauma seriously, we also need to understand that everyone we encounter who has experienced trauma isn't necessarily continuing to experience trauma symptoms over time. And again, I want to point the SAMHSA's definition of trauma, an event, series of event, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And so that experienced by an individual, it's totally subjective. What is traumatic for one person might not be traumatic for another. So here are the trauma symptoms that might be causing disruption in someone's life. You can see that a couple of these symptoms are related to that overactive alarm system and the fact that resources from your cognitive, rational, conscious brain have been rerouted to deal with the alarm system and detecting threat. So things like hypervigilance, obviously, the alarm system is sounding unnecessarily. Intrusive thoughts, nightmares, and flashbacks. These are all ways of your brain trying to develop mastery over the event that happened to you by revisiting it repeatedly. And then others of these symptoms, like withdrawing from others and sadness and hopelessness, are related just to the emotional impact that experiencing trauma has. When you're thinking about how traumatized is someone, it's how much are these symptoms impacting their life and their day-to-day functioning. So to turn to where it really matters for our purposes and our work is that trauma impacts how we remember and how memory gets formed. So think about those sections of the brain again. In your day-to-day normal functioning, you're bringing in information through your five senses, and it's all sets of data. It's not integrated together. So what you see, what you hear, what you taste, smell, all of that is coming in, and it goes to your limbic system where it's integrated together into a coherent, this is what's happening to me right now, understanding. And then either it's passed up to our cognitive brain, our conscious brain, where it's turned into a chronological account. So if you ask someone to remember what they did this morning, they're going to that chronological account that their brain created, that the neocortex was involved in creating. However, if you've brought in all this information from your senses and you've detected threat in your limbic system, that information is being passed back to the older, more instinctual parts of the brain. And it's not going through the same process that memory normally does when it's being organized into a chronological way. Additionally, we normally have the conscious ability to control our attention. So for instance, you're writing an email and the phone rings, you can decide to ignore the phone. But when you're dealing with a threat, when you think that you are in danger, your brain is going to focus not on whatever it wants, but on what do I need to do to cope with or escape this threat. So what's going to be remembered is where that attention went for your survival. So the memory you end up with is really fragmented. It's difficult to discuss in a chronological way. You would expect a jumbled retelling from a witness. Perception of time is impacted. People will feel like a traumatic event went on much longer than it actually did, and also much shorter than it actually did. So you might be interviewing someone about a traumatic event, and they are absolutely not your ideal witness. They might not remember what the perpetrator was wearing, what they looked like, because they were totally focused on escape and survival. But that doesn't mean there still isn't information there that if you approach it in a strategic and sensitive way, you can access. It just might be organized in a way that's different than what you would expect. I want to plug here that the Innocence Commission did a really wonderful training last summer with Evocavi, which is an organization that we found through the Quattrone Center. And they taught us about the cognitive interview process, which I think there's another presentation in this resource center that discusses the cognitive interview process. But those are both excellent tools for understanding, accessing traumatized memory. Okay, I'm going to pause here before I start talking about our victim services program and how we've applied a little bit of the science. If there are any questions in the chat or if anyone else has questions. Okay, so like I mentioned, the Innocence Commission is a state agency, so we always had obligations to crime victims before we had a formal victim services program. We have statutory notification, and that was carried out by our executive director. And there were two instances that really spurred the decision to go after grant funding to start in-house victim services. The first I was told about in my interview for this role, where there was a high-profile exoneration case. And at the hearing, when the judge announced the result that this person was being exonerated, the victim's family got up and ran out of the room, and the only person with them was a reporter. There was another case where we had a commission hearing, and we had 10 members of the family come and attend that hearing. And additionally, they had a really difficult experience with the media. So it was becoming clear that the need was there, that it was beyond what our statutory notification provided. And we needed to put some resources there to provide victims support and information. So that first grant was to increase meaningful participation for crime victims. And I want to note that originally VOCA did not recognize exonerees as victims. So we were not allowed to use this funding for creating supports and services for exonerees. Our victim services program is now state funded, so we have a lot more flexibility in how we administer victim services. And we have since developed specific resources and supports for exonerees as well. So I was hired on in early 2020 and given this charge to create a victim services program. And so there were the basic questions I had to answer. Who counts as a victim? Who receives services? When do we notify victims? When do they become involved in this process? And how is this going to impact investigations? So totally straightforward. However, if you're investigating a case that's 10 or 20 or 30 years old, it all gets so much more complicated and muddied. So for who counts as a victim, we go really broad. There's the person most seriously harmed by the crime and their immediate family, but often also their extended family is involved in the case in some way or somehow. I also count many witnesses as secondary victims, people who are traumatized or victimized through their witnessing of the crime, and so they get services as well. And when I say services, I mean that when we have to contact them or notify them, that notification is done by me as a victim advocate. We have referrals to community-based service providers. I attend their interviews to act as their advocate and give them an opportunity to ask questions and make their needs known. And then I continue to be on call for them to provide emotional support or connection after interviews and throughout the investigation process. Additionally, we provide financial support to victims who want to attend our hearings to cover the cost of travel. And then victim notification. So we all know you have to balance the knowledge that doing notification can cause harm with knowing that victims have the right to this information. And then again, knowing that many of these cases don't go anywhere and get closed pretty quickly. So our original statute said you have to provide notification when a case reaches the stage formal inquiry, which essentially means we found new information about the crime and we're moving towards the hearing. We're just collecting everything else that's left to collect before we get to a hearing. We now do it earlier. So our guiding rule of thumb is that victims will always hear about a case from us and not from anyone else in the community. So I rely on investigators to really map out how news that an investigation is being conducted might ripple out within a community. Which witnesses or people involved in the case know other people? How are they connected with the family or with the victims? And we have to pay really close attention. We're in North Carolina. We have a lot of small rural communities, and we need to be realistic about how information can travel in those communities. And then what does it mean to have victim services at the same agency as investigators? I'm really fortunate to work somewhere that is a small, tight-knit office. So we did a lot of relationship building and open communication before all of this was getting implemented and while it was being implemented. I could bring the principles of victim advocacy into the office, but I really relied on our investigators to say, well, what about this weird thing that's happened to me? How would you handle that? And so we can incorporate all of that into policies. I needed them to say, this is what it really looks like on the ground to make those policies and practices useful for them. I think one of the strengths of having victim services is that there's clear role distinction. Our former executive director noted that it was awkward and difficult to be responsible for victim notification and providing information and support, while at the same time making all the decisions about that notification. So she couldn't making all the decisions about that investigation. So she couldn't go to victims in a totally transparent way, in the same way that I can because I'm boundaried from those investigative decisions. I also think that preserves investigators' focus to know that I'm a tool that can handle the difficult emotional and human side of the investigation. And while I may request a different approach from our investigators when they need to interact with victims and with secondary victims. That relationship building piece took place first, so we can really work together and trust that one another honors the goals we have, and we can meet everybody's goals. There's a quote that I think is the best about trauma, and it's by Danielle Surratt, and she wrote the book Until We Reckon, which is about restorative justice. And she writes, "The opposite of trauma is not healing. The opposite of trauma is power." And so when you think about all the things that increase trauma response and stress, like uncertainty, like unkindness, there's the opposite of that, which is how do we instead integrate power, choice, safety, transparency, and warmth? So these are the things we try and do when we're interacting with crime victims and secondary victims. We're really thorough when we discuss case confidentiality, what that means for them, when and how case information is made public. Whenever possible, we give someone control about where and when the interview is scheduled. And we prepare that person for any next steps so they know what's happening after they've engaged with us. So for instance, even when we can't schedule somewhere at someone's ideal location and we end up at the courthouse, we can make the decision to hold that interview in a room that's off the main hallways so that there's more privacy. And we'll always set up that room in a way that if someone's walking down the hallway, they can't just look in and see who is speaking with us. And we say that. We'll say, I want you to know the way the table is, no one can walk down this hallway and look in and just see you. So those little changes that say, I've thought consciously about your safety and your privacy, and while these steps are small, we still took them to maintain those things for you. And then the other thing is, how do you give someone a little bit of power? One of the things is just to ask at the end of the interview, do you have any remaining concerns? What's the best way to reach out to you? And to honor that they're in control in telling you about what works for them. Our policies and practices include our victim notification policy, which I've discussed. Like I said, I really relied on our investigators to tell me how to craft that piece around timeliness, to tell me that case information can get out into the community. The other thing investigators brought to my attention is that there are, in rare cases, cases where DNA testing would end with an exoneration moving very quickly. So your single perpetrator stranger rape cases, for instance, where we've found an untested rape kit, it's happened before, where we've ended up moving with that exoneration very quickly. So in those cases, we'll prepare to do early notification again, so it can be timely. Again, the emphasis is on choice and preparation for what's next. I make it my practice of providing information in a couple of ways during notification. I always like to do a notification by phone first so they can hear that I am a human person on the other end of the line and they can initially react to that. But then I provide all that information in a letter so they can refer to it again, or they can share it with support people in their life and say, I'm not totally sure what's happening, but this is everything I have about it. And then with trauma-informed interviewing, like I mentioned, we've gotten some really excellent training on how to apply the science to approach interviews in a way that can evoke memory that was recorded during a traumatic event. Again, that control and power piece of location and time of the interview. And then I think another thing that has worked really well is asking the person we're interviewing how they would like us to refer to them and how they would like us to refer to the victim. So for instance, you're interviewing the victim's cousin and that person has never used the victim's government name. And it would be really alienating and weird to hear you say that person's government name over and over again. And so they can say, no, this is how I want you to call him because this is who he was to me. We also try and give a little bit of power back by asking, how do you want us to refer to the crime? Because some people will feel very offended if they feel like you're minimizing the um, the pain and the immensity of the crime. If you're saying when this victim got killed instead of murdered, and then of course on the other end, people might not want to hear that language. I want to talk quickly about one of the cases that demonstrated how collaboration between my role and investigators was important because the case was so complicated. So this is a case that we investigated. It was a second-degree murder case, a drive-by shooting at a park. One person was killed, but there were a large number of people there who were secondary victims and witnesses who were also shot at and traumatized by that event. And over the case review, the investigator really determined that there was one avenue for an innocence investigation. There was one witness, which, depending on how that interview went, would probably end further innocence investigation or provoke more investigation. So we looked into this person and determined that they were not connected to the victim and to his family. And so that interview took place because they were a secondary victim. I handled notification and attended that interview, and then it became clear that the case was going to move forward. In further review, our investigator discovered that some of the people at the park who were witnesses were also the victim's cousins. And so before they were approached by our investigation, then I did notification of the immediate family members, and the victim's sister became our point person for the family. And then when the case came to hearing, we pulled up our calendars and started looking at scheduling the dates of the hearing. And the victim had a 1-year-old child at the time he was killed. And I had mapped out significant dates, so things like birthdays, the date of the crime. And that 1-year-old child's birthday, the child had since gone on to be in the care of his parents, overlapped with the dates that we were originally going to schedule the hearing. So we were able to make that change so the family could attend and not have that additional pain of knowing we're thinking about the murder of our son while attending the hearing and our grandson's birthday taking place. So there was really close interaction between myself and the investigators because that case was so complicated. At every point, we were trying to figure out, okay, is this person a secondary victim? How are they connected to others in the case? What can we do to advocate for them and their needs, give them a little bit of power and control back, and uphold their safety? So it's a pretty close relationship between myself and investigators. I've talked about mapping out how a case might move through the community and how information about that case might travel through a community. The other thing is that support for victims prior to and during and after interviews increases the level of safety. To have someone say beforehand, what are your concerns? What are your questions? What are you wondering? To do that at every point, it increases feelings of comfort, and it has absolutely resulted in more disclosure from people who are engaged in our investigations. Again, I can provide emotional support after interviews that wouldn't be totally appropriate for investigators to provide. If they've done an interview that's resulted in someone getting very upset and then called afterward to deal with that, doesn't make sense for their role. So I can step in and be a tool there. I can also identify and reduce barriers for people participating in our investigations and help our investigators craft really flexible strategies for reaching everyone that needs to be involved. But of course, it can get challenging. For instance, we have cases where a victim needs to be interviewed and they're not being responsive and cooperative, and the next step is to issue a subpoena. And obviously that undercuts a lot of what we're trying to do in giving choice and power back. But that's the reality of the investigation. So we have to, again, be collaborative about when and how are we escalating when we need to get someone involved, and what kind of support and transparency can we provide after we've issued a subpoena and spoken with them. going to pause again for any questions, if anything's come up so far, or comments or thoughts.
Not seeing anything in the chat, so I think you're good to keep going.
Okay. So we've talked about this trauma-informed approach externally, how we're engaging with victims and witnesses and defendants, but it starts with us. It starts with our staff and the way we deal with our own trauma exposure response. And it starts with us because we set the tone of safety and disclosure and respect. And we can't do that if we come into an interaction and we're stressed out and we're agitated and frustrated and acting cold. When we engage and listen with a fresh perspective and receive what's being told to us, that all of that requires we manage our stress response. And when we do that, we're calming the person that we're with. So for instance, think about attending a job interview. You are so much more relaxed when the interviewer greets you warmly and thanks you for your answers and your time and affirms that they're hearing you. So we have to show up at these interactions in a way where our stress isn't going to influence the person that we are speaking with. So to understand our stress response, I like to use this spectrum. It's obvious our work is stressful, the stakes are really high. We are in this work because we care about making things better, and that amount of care and investment is so important for this job, but it also makes us really vulnerable. So when you're thinking about your stress and your stress levels, we've got normative stress on one end, and that's kind of the stress that gets you to perform, the stress that makes you study for a test or prepare for a deadline. And then you have those trauma symptoms, the stress where you really feel under threat at the other end. And the intensity of your reaction to any particular event is influenced by a bunch of factors, whether that event occurs one time or again and again, if you have a personal history or prior trauma exposure, and then the quote protective factors, or the things in your life that provide you support so you have resources to handle stress. So when you think about reading about crime all the time, doing these interviews that can be very emotionally taxing, you're probably at the end of normative to emotionally costly stress, but there's so many other factors you can think about in reducing that stress response to your work. And my least favorite thing in the world is starting with self-care. We too often start this conversation about what can you do at an individual level to lower your stress response. But instead, I want to think about it through the lens of the social and ecological model, which is this figure of all the circles on the right. Where are there points of intervention where you can build up supports and intervene with stress? For instance, at the social level, can you talk about your work, or do you feel really isolated by your role? I know that I hate to say what I do at a party. I can't even say the word homicide around my family. They find it very upsetting. So I can't, in the same way, connect with them about work as other members of the family can. A supportive work environment makes all of the difference in how you're experiencing stress and trauma response. So are you able to make mistakes and bring ideas and issues to your supervisor or to your coworkers? Do you feel like you have the training to do your job well? Do you have positive relationships with your coworker? And then we can think about, how are you managing your own personal stress? What are your habits and practices that help you feel calm when you're leaving the workplace? So obviously there are many things here on this level going up through individual to societal that we can't change, but there are points where we can intervene and build up supports. Again, thinking about where do you increase choice and safety and trust and transparency that is beyond the individual level. This figure is from the book Trauma Stewardship, which I'll cite again at the end because it's really wonderful. But managing trauma exposure response is a part of this job because we're exposed to so much suffering. We're exposed to some really horrible facts of life. and we need to be aware of and on the lookout for all of these symptoms. So some of these responses aren't just things you're doing at an individual level or something you see your coworkers do. They can become part of your workplace culture. Some of these are bad attempts at managing trauma response. Things like cynicism and numbing and black and white thinking. You don't want to deal with the pain of being disappointed, the pain of empathizing with someone and things not going the way you wanted to. So instead, you're relying on numbing and cynicism. And that can become a culture-wide response to the suffering that you're encountering. But if you're not managing the stress response and the trauma exposure response, again, you're in this state where you've rerouted resources from the ways that you can think with the most complexity, from your creativity to dealing with your threat. So it's making you worse at your job. The opposite of these symptoms are characteristics that'll promote resiliency, like curiosity and persistence, risk-taking, and courage. This is a wonderful quote from Trauma Stewardship about the response. She says, often people start recognizing the effect of trauma exposure when they realize they are behaving in a way they never would have when they first started working in the field. So ask yourself, are you maintaining the values that drove you to this work? Do you still feel like yourself? Do you show up for your friends and coworkers and community in a positive way? Or are you managing with cynicism and numbing? Are you unable to be empathetic towards the people you got into this work to help? Be really conscientious about how being exposed to suffering is going to bleed out into your life and into the ways you show up for other people. Again, I can't stress enough. Anticipating and preparing for trauma exposure and the ways that you're handling it, that's a part of this job, and it's a part of doing this job well. And social connection culture are those strong protections against being overwhelmed by trauma response. So if we think about our workplace and where you can promote social connection, I don't have on this list being able to have fun with your coworkers and lighten the mood, but that should be there. But starting from your supervision level, our supervisors can set the tone by demonstrating how to appropriately debrief and process difficult case moments. They can acknowledge that difficulties and challenges in these cases are common. They can identify where skill building can make someone feel more in control and increase their sense of competency at this work. And they can be clear about what's just simply outside of your control. They can say, you tried your best, and there's just really not a way to handle this except going out into the field and doing this investigation the best way you can. See your coworkers as resources. First, you can help one another strategize, so no tough case decision ends on one person's shoulders. Your coworkers also know the really specific challenges of your job. And I'll say, I have been to plenty of vicarious trauma trainings. I thought I knew what vicarious trauma was, that I would be fixated on case details. I'd be distressed about what the people I was working with were going through. That would take up my time and my life outside of work. But one of the most emotional and challenging parts of my job is doing that initial victim notification phone call. And I realized I was picking up the phone to make doctor's appointments or call my family, and I was getting so stressed, and I had the sense I'm about to cause someone pain on the other end of this phone. And I didn't have someone there to say, oh yes, making notification calls is incredibly emotional and taxing, and your phone might become the symbol for that, right? So I wasn't recognizing the way that trauma exposure was showing up in me because I had gotten generic vicarious trauma training. So your coworkers can be the people who say, these are the specific things that are challenging and hard and what you can look out for. I also think talking openly about trauma exposure in the people that you're engaging with in investigations really helps you talk about it internally. It makes it much more normalized. It helps you recognize it when it shows up. for you and for your coworkers. So to start the conversation about secondary trauma or vicarious trauma in the workplace, there are these two surveys. They're both excellent. You've got ProQual, or the Professional Quality of Life Measure, which is a free tool. You can take the survey online. It gives you the results online without you having to enter all your information. And it essentially measures on the personal level, where are you at with the level of burnout and the level of secondary traumatic stress. It also measures your compassion satisfaction. So that as a protective factor that gives you the resources to do your job. Do you feel like you're doing your job well? Are you connecting with people? Do you feel like you're doing something helpful in the world? That sense can give you the resources you need when you encounter the really tough sides of the job. And then on the right, the Vicarious Trauma Organizational Survey, which is created by the Office of Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center, which looks over all of these organizational domains and can help you think about, at a policy level, at an organizational level, how do we build support in for all of our employees and help support them in doing emotionally challenging work. And then these are excellent readings, Trauma Stewardship that I've talked about already, and then this Trauma Sensitive Workbook that has a ton of great information and exercises that you can work through either personally or as a group. So another wonderful place to start. And then finally, if you don't have the resources to launch an entire victim services program and have someone in your office that is talking about trauma all the time, the way that I am in my office, there are things you can do to build up your services without the budget. So first, most states have a coalition against sexual assault. So in North Carolina, we have the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault that oversee all of our rape crisis centers and can really map out the landscape of available resources. Victim advocates have a ton of expertise. There are tons of advocates out there who have 20 years in the field and will really be happy to help you figure out, what do I do if someone's having a hard time? What resources are out there so I can make sure that they've been met with something. So, and again, build those relationships before those case moments come up. So you have a rapport established, they understand your intentions before you get hit with a case moment that really requires some extra resources. Look at your policies and practices and ask yourself, where can we insert more choice? Where can we discuss safety really thoroughly with people? How do we prepare them for next steps? Ask yourself, is everything we have really in legal jargon, or will it make sense for the people we engage with in our investigations? And then your own organizational culture. We have an ethical responsibility to prepare for trauma response, because when we are prepared, we do better by the people impacted by our investigations. So ask yourself again, where in your culture can you promote transparency, trust, collaboration, creativity, choice? And then before opening up to any other questions or comments, I want to plug the Innocence Commission has been working with a researcher out of Western Carolina University, and he has sent out a survey to understand victim services across conviction integrity units and conviction review units. Your organization might have received that survey. You should receive a reminder shortly. And the purpose of that is just to map out, what are victim serving professionals in this space doing? How can we connect with one another? How can we share best practices? So I would really, really appreciate it if you participated in that, and please be on the lookout for it. And I'll stop there. Thank you all.
Emma, that was spectacular. Thank you so much, and it was so pleasant to listen to you speak, and you had such great information. We're really grateful for your time today. If folks have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. You'll also see that the post-meeting evaluation has just popped up on your screen. We wanted to ask folks to participate before people have to hop off. Emma, I'm seeing some nice things in the chat from your colleagues.
Thanks, guys.
Glad to have you. So as we're waiting for folks to drop their questions in, Emma, I have a question. So let's say folks go and take the survey that you mentioned to
Hmm.
measure where they're at, and they come up with, oh no, things are not that good. What can folks do um, quickly to address any burnout or vicarious trauma that they might be feeling already?
Well, unfortunately, like I said, I prefer the system-wide response or your organizational response. But if you're in the position where you need to act quickly, you're going to have to start on the individual level. Figure out practices that give you resources and energy in your life. How can you connect? For instance, there's a ton of research around the benefits of going outside and being in nature. That's one place you can start if you're really in a crisis zone. But truly, what you need to think about is how can I connect in my whole workplace and bring up this conversation and connect with my coworkers and engage with one another. So start with trauma stewardship. That book will give you some really great practical tips. It's also like holding up a mirror, so be prepared to have to really think about yourself and how you're responding to your work. So again, that resource is excellent.
And if nothing else, just enjoy the comics in trauma stewardship for a moment or two.
Yes,
There's
yeah.
some great
Spend time with
illustrations.
your pets. I mean, there are all of these things that like have a real evidence base in reducing stress and promoting connection that feel super basic, but things like hanging out with your pets, going outside, being part of a community organization or a religious group, those are all considered protective factors.
Thanks, Emma. So folks can continue to put questions in the chat if there are any, and I'm just looking for raised hands in the room as well. We appreciate folks joining us today. Please stay tuned next month. Next month will be a DNA heavy and specific conversation. We will discuss the NIST DNA and Human Factors report written by their expert working group. We'll have a member of the expert working group presenting to us. So we're really able to offer a wide range of topics here in this monthly meeting space, and I'm so glad that folks continue to join us every month. As always, Quattrone Center continues to offer consulting through with each of our staff. You can always email us to set up an appointment. And I'm going to take one more sweep for questions. All right, I don't see any more questions in the room, so we will go ahead and say goodbye. Thank you so much, Emma, for your time, for your
Thank you for
presentation.
having me.
It's a great hour. Looking forward to seeing everyone next month. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Emma.